It was the late winter of 1889 when the train limped into Ember Hollow, bleeding steam into the sky. Its wheels shrieked across rust and gravel as if dragging pain behind it. The town, quiet and wary, watched from behind lace curtains and weather-worn shutters, measuring newcomers like threats. From that train, people disembarked in small clusters, families, laborers, couples pressing forward with purpose. All of them had names, destinations, and the safety of someone waiting. But one woman stepped off alone. She wore a shawl that had forgotten its original color, wrapped tightly across narrow shoulders. Her boots were too large, her dress torn at the hem and smudged with soot. Dust clung to her cheeks, sweat darkened her temples, and a bruise bloomed just below her jaw, mostly hidden beneath a frayed scarf. She did not speak. She did not scan the crowd for familiar faces. She simply stood still, clutching a small cloth bag like it held the last breath in her chest. From the station booth, a man leaned out. He was the station master, and his voice was worn like his coat when he asked, not unkindly, "Name?" She blinked, slowly. There was no fear in her, only exhaustion. After a pause, she said, "I don't have one." He frowned and said, "Well, everyone's got a name, miss." "Not anymore," she answered, her voice dry and cracked like parched earth. He started to say something else but didn't. Maybe it was the look in her eyes. Something feral, something emptied out. So he handed her a slip of paper, with a half-hearted shrug, turned to the next name on the list, and she walked, directionless, into Ember Hollow. The town offered nothing. Children stared. A shopkeeper muttered low about women who didn't know their place. A woman standing in the doorway of the boarding house took one look at her and shut the door in her face before she could speak. By sundown, the woman had found a corner behind the saloon where the ground was dry and the wind passed her by. She curled up, using her cloth bag as a pillow. Her eyes searched the sky, not for comfort, but for something more distant than mercy. That night, she did not sleep. Men laughed somewhere beyond the alley. Drunk, loud, careless. One voice drawled with malice. "Pretty one, that. Bet she'd be grateful for company." Another chuckled in reply. "Grateful's not what I'm looking for." Footsteps dragged toward her. She didn't wait. Her hand moved instinctively, reaching into her boot for the patch knife she'd kept close since the day she left everything behind. But before she had the chance to breathe, a heavy silence fell over the alley. A shadow stood at its edge, broad-shouldered, unmoving, the kind of stillness that made even the wind hesitate. He didn't speak, didn't lift a hand, didn't need to. One of the drunk men whispered, "Rain," and both figures vanished into the dark like dogs that had caught the scent of something meaner than themselves. She remained where she was, heart hammering, hand tight around the knife. She watched him, this stranger who had chased no one, but cleared the alley with presence alone. He stood in silence, looking her way, unmoving, not stepping closer, not speaking, not offering food nor asking questions. He just stood there, watching, not with pity, not with desire, just watching. And then he turned and left. That was how Elise came to Ember Hollow. She had no name, no husband, no place to go. But something in the world had shifted that night, because Coulter Rain, the man whose name still traveled in whispers, the one folks feared more than fire, had seen her. And though she did not yet know it, that would be the last night she slept in the dirt. By the next morning, Ember Hollow was humming, not with kindness, but with curiosity. Word spread like it always did in small places, crooked, fast, and poisoned by opinion. "That woman," they said. "No name, no ring. Probably a runaway," someone else added. "I heard she came from the east," came another voice, hushed and eager. "Where the fire was. That place near Briarline." and then always the question behind their teeth. Did Coulter Rain look at her? No, someone scoffed. He wouldn't. He's not that kind of man. Maybe, said a third voice, more thoughtful. Maybe he just saw something he recognized. Elise, unaware or simply unmoved, wandered the town's worn roads, trying again. She offered her hands to the bakery, was told no work here. The tailor laughed when she asked for sewing. No name? No letters of good standing? No chance, he said, waving her off like dust. By dusk, she returned to the same alley where she'd curled up the night before. Her limbs ached, her stomach howled. She leaned against the brick, pressed her forehead to the wall and let the tears fall. Slow, silent, the kind that carried no sound but the weight of surrender. And then again, a shadow. She did not startle this time. Her tears did not stop. She looked up. It was him, Coulter Rain. The scar along his jaw caught the last light of dusk, barely visible beneath a trimmed but rough beard. His gray eyes met hers, quiet, searching, holding something back. He didn't speak. He just extended a hand, rough, unshaken. She stared at it a long while, and then, because there was no one else left in the world to follow, she took it. Coulter didn't lead her through town. He led her around it, down a trail no one used anymore, past where the creek ran dry, into foothills so quiet the silence felt like a presence, like something alive. His horse waited just beyond the bend, patient and still. He lifted her onto the saddle behind him, said nothing. She said nothing too. The land grew harsher as they climbed, rockier, lonelier. The wind carried no song, only the whisper of forgotten names. She held to the back of his coat, unsure if she was being rescued or stolen. But she didn't let go. They rode until dusk turned to dark, until Ember Hollow was gone behind them, swallowed by the ridge. And finally, they reached it. The cabin stood low and weathered, half-eaten by vines and time. It looked like it had been carved out of the mountain itself, squat, stubborn and unwilling to fall. Smoke curled from the chimney, the only sign of life. There was no lantern to welcome them. Coulter dismounted first, tied the horse without looking at her. Then, wordlessly, he opened the cabin door. He looked back once, just once. And Elise, with her name burned away and her body worn hollow, stepped inside. The cabin smelled of old ash and burnt coffee. Smoke clung to the walls like memory. Inside, the light was soft, flickering from a low fire in a stone hearth. The air was warm, but it wasn't welcoming. Not yet. It was a place that tolerated life, not one that invited it in. There were only 2 rooms. One had a narrow cot, with a wool blanket folded with military care. The other, a large bed carved from rough timber, the kind a man built when he didn't expect to share it. Coulter pointed to the cot. He placed a basin of water on the table beside it, set down a plate, bread and stew still warm. Then he left the room. No words, no instructions. Elise moved like someone who expected the floor to vanish beneath her feet. She sat slowly, touched the plate with trembling fingers. She didn't ask herself why she trusted him. Not really. Trust wasn't the word for what she felt. There was simply no part of him that reached toward her. Not in hunger, not in pity. He hadn't pulled her from the alley to make her grateful. He had done it the way one might rescue a drowning stranger, without hope, without reward. And so she ate. She washed. And for the first time in weeks, she lay down without the press of stone at her back. But sleep didn't come easily. The silence was too thick, too unfamiliar. She had grown used to the noise of threat, the way cities whispered behind doors and alleys threatened behind laughter. But here, the silence was its own kind of voice. It told her, this place has ghosts. The next morning, she woke before the sun. A blanket she hadn't remembered pulling up was tucked under her chin. She sat up, slow and disoriented, and noticed the sounds outside. Measured, deliberate. The rhythm of an axe striking wood. She stood, stepped to the window. Coulter was there. His shirt darkened with sweat, arms rising and falling as he split logs with the focus of a man trying to forget something he'd never be allowed to. His silence was different from the world's silence. The world ignored. His silence remembered. In Ember Hollow, meanwhile, the mouths moved quickly. They said, "He took her up there." They said, "No one's lived in that cabin since..." And then they lowered their voices, as if afraid to summon ghosts by name. "Since the fire." "She's trouble," they whispered. "Mark my words." But Coulter Rain did not care for the words of men. He returned to town once, to the general store. When someone asked about the woman, he said nothing. Just looked at them. Long enough that no one asked again. Back at the cabin, Elise did not rest. She scrubbed the table, washed the dishes, mended a torn curtain with thread that barely held. She did it not because she owed him, but because doing something, anything, was better than letting the silence chew through her. That night she sat by the fire. A cup of weak tea warmed her hands. He stood in the doorway, watched the flames for a long time. Then he said, "Eat. Sleep. Leave when you're strong." She looked up, surprised by the voice more than the words. It was deep, but not hard. Quiet, but not cold. She studied his face, scarred, hollow. Not cruel, but shaped by grief. "I have nowhere to go," she answered. He didn't respond, just stared into the fire. His jaw tight. Outside wind clawed at the eaves, but inside something held still. For the first time in weeks, Elise didn't feel afraid. She didn't know his story. He didn't ask for hers. But something unspoken passed between them. Like the firelight itself had drawn a line neither of them would cross. Not yet. The days at the cabin passed without count. Elise rose before the fire went cold. She swept the floor, hauled water from the creek, kept her hands busy. Coulter left before dawn and returned by nightfall, each day without explanation. He brought things, firewood, turnips, dried beans, but never words. She didn't ask where he went. He didn't ask why she stayed. There was rhythm now, a kind of uneasy peace. But peace, like silence, has weight. And the stillness was starting to feel like a secret. One evening, when his back was turned and the sun just a smear of red on the sky, she followed him. Not far. Just to the edge of the ridge, where he always vanished. She kept her distance, slipping between scrub trees and low boulders, the way a woman learns to move when the world has taught her to hide. She watched him kneel at a clearing, beside two crude wooden crosses, one taller, one small. He didn't kneel like a man in prayer. He didn't cry. He just sat, his head bowed, shoulders stiff, the kind of posture that comes from holding grief in the same place too long. The wind caught the hem of his coat. A twig cracked beneath her boot. His head jerked up. Their eyes met. She froze. Coulter stood slowly and walked straight toward her. Elise braced herself. Her throat tightened. Her pulse thudded in her ears. But he didn't raise his voice, didn't reach for her. He only said, "Don't follow me." She nodded. Her voice was barely a whisper. "I'm sorry." That night, she packed. She told herself it was the right thing. He hadn't invited her to stay. He owed her nothing. She had taken too much already. She folded her clothes, tucked away the half-eaten loaf of bread, a sliver of soap. The same way she had packed every time before, quietly, efficiently, with hands that had learned how to disappear. Before dawn, she slipped out the door. The mountain air bit hard. She didn't look back, but the trail was longer than she remembered, colder than it had been. Her legs shook. Her stomach was an echo of emptiness. The boots, too large, rubbed her heels raw. By midday, her body gave out near a dry riverbed. She collapsed to her knees, breath hitching. She thought of her father's voice, sharp, judgmental, of the man she had once promised herself to. His hands too rough, his demands too endless. The locked room, the slap, the silence that followed her like a second shadow. She had no name, no husband, no destination, and now, no strength. When she opened her eyes again, the sky had darkened. But the stars weren't out yet. A shape moved above her. Coulter. He said nothing. He didn't ask why. He didn't scold. He only lifted her in his arms as if she weighed nothing and carried her back into the mountains. She was too tired to resist, too tired to even cry. When they reached the cabin, he didn't lay her on the cot. He took her to his room, to the big bed. Gently, he placed her there, pulled a blanket up to her chin, and left the room. Moments later, she heard a door close softly, then another, and then nothing. She was alone, in his bed, surrounded by cedar and firelight and the unfamiliar comfort of being carried, not taken. And for the first time in a long time, Elise let herself sleep. She slept, but it was not restful. Sleep came in flashes, images she couldn't hold, names she couldn't remember, the sharp heat of memory pressing against her skin. And beneath it all, the ache of her body deepened into something fevered. When she woke, the room was too bright and too far away. Her lips were cracked, her limbs heavy. She tried to sit up, but the world spun sideways. Then a cool cloth touched her forehead. She opened her eyes. Coulter was there, kneeling beside the bed. His coat smelled of cedar and smoke. His eyes, always distant, were now close enough to study, and what she saw in them wasn't pity. It was focus, worry wrapped in silence. She tried to speak. Only a hoarse breath came out. He said nothing, only reached for a small tin near the table, pressed a bitter root into her mouth, held a canteen steady as she drank. He didn't leave her. Not that night. Not the next. For 3 days, Elise drifted through the current of fever. She saw glimpses, his shadow moving across the wall, his hand brushing the sweat from her hair, the soft click of a chair as he sat beside her bed. A voice, his voice, murmuring low words to the fire. Not prayers, just sound, steady and grounding. She was aware enough to know he never once touched her without need. Never looked at her as a man might look at something fragile or tempting. Only as someone who had decided she was not to be left alone. When she finally woke fully, the fever broken, she found herself beneath a different quilt, heavier, softer, with a subtle floral stitching at the hem. Her hair had been braided loosely, strands tucked away with care. She turned her head toward the window. Coulter was there in the chair, half asleep, head tilted back, arms folded like a man who had not allowed himself rest until he was certain she would live. He looked tired, paler than usual, but grounded, present. She whispered, "You stayed." He opened his eyes, looked at her with a slow nod, as if the question didn't need asking. "Of course I did." There was no tenderness in his voice, no sentiment. And yet, it was more than any gesture she'd known. It wasn't affection. It wasn't obligation. It was something older, something elemental. That evening, Elise managed to sit at the table. He set a bowl of stew in front of her, the movements quiet, unceremonious. He sat across from her. The fire popped gently between them. She said, "Thank you." He didn't answer right away, just stirred his stew once, twice. Then he asked, "You got a name?" She hesitated, looked into the flames as if an answer might rise from the coals, then shook her head. Not anymore. He nodded, slow, measured, and said nothing else. The silence stretched between them, not empty but full, like the hush that follows thunder, the kind that waits, not because there's nothing left to say, but because the ground hasn't settled yet. Outside, snow began to fall, soft, relentless. Inside, she watched the way his hands moved. Careful, efficient, the scar on his knuckle, the way he cleaned the rifle not as a weapon, but as something that had shared his solitude. And for the first time since arriving at the cabin, she wasn't afraid of him. She was afraid of what she might come to feel for him if she stayed too long. Strength came back slowly. Each morning, Elise rose before the fire dimmed. She swept ash from the hearth, filled the kettle, kneaded dough with fingers still learning warmth again. Coulter never asked her to do any of it, but he never stopped her either. There was rhythm now, not comfort exactly, but something quieter than loneliness, stillness that didn't press against her ribs. And then one day, while looking for blankets in the barn loft, she found the chest. It was tucked beneath an old saddle, worn and sun-bleached. Its lid creaked like it hadn't been opened in years. She didn't mean to pry, but grief calls to grief. Inside she found a photograph, edges bent, corners cracked. It showed Coulter, younger by a few winters, standing beside a blonde-haired woman whose smile was half-formed, unsure. Between them stood a little girl, gap-toothed, with a bow in her hair tied just slightly crooked. The girl was grinning, wild and unself-conscious. Beneath the photo lay a scrap of fabric, pale green burned along one edge. It had once been part of a dress. At the bottom, tucked beneath the lining, was a letter, half-charred. The ink had bled from heat and time. Only fragments remained. Waited all night. She was coughing again. Please come home. Coulter, I'm scared. Elise stared at the paper until her eyes stung. She closed the lid, sat back on a curl of hay and dust. Her hands trembled. The past had teeth, and it had just bitten deep. That night she didn't speak at supper. Her hands moved mechanically, lifting spoon to mouth, setting bowl down again. Coulter watched her, not closely but long enough to see the shift. Finally, he said, "You found it." There was no anger in his voice, no tension, only weariness. She nodded. He didn't look away. "I wasn't supposed to be gone that long," he said. "The horse threw a shoe in town. Took longer than I thought." He stared into the fire. "They had smoke in their lungs by the time I got back. The doctor said it was too late." She swallowed the tightness rising in her throat. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I buried them behind the ridge," he continued. "But I couldn't bury the sound. I still hear it. When I sleep. When I don't." Elise looked down at her hands, pale and unsteady in the firelight. "I hear things too," she said. "Doors slamming. My father's voice. My own name. Before they took it from me." He turned his eyes to her then, not with pity, with recognition. She added quietly, "You didn't take me." Her voice caught. "You saved me, even if you didn't mean to." The wind rattled against the shutters, soft at first, then sharp, but neither of them moved. And for the first time, Coulter looked at her not as a stranger who had wandered too far into his solitude, but as someone who had found her way into it on purpose. Spring threatened at the edges of the hills, but Ember Hollow was still gripped by winter's last breath. Snow clung to the shadows. The wind no longer howled, it whispered. But gossip had begun to thaw. "She's still up there," folks murmured over coffee and whiskey. "Living with him? Like a wife." "She's not right," someone said. "No decent woman would stay with Coulter Rain." And then, as rumors do, the story caught the wrong ear. Judson Hale rode into Ember Hollow like a man with a badge and something to prove. He hadn't shown his face since Coulter broke his brother's jaw in a saloon fight no one ever spoke of. But now, Hale wore a new star on his chest and a telegram in his pocket, from the capital. It described a missing woman, a judge's daughter. Last seen boarding a westbound train. The word abducted was underlined in pencil. Hale recognized the face in the sketch. He didn't wait. He mounted his horse and rode into the hills. That morning, Elise was hanging clothes to dry when the dog barked. Once, then again. She looked up. A man on horseback was approaching, sunlight glinting off the badge on his coat. Behind the barn, Coulter stepped out, rifle slung across his back, eyes narrowing like shutters against a storm. Judson Hale tipped his hat without warmth. "Didn't figure you for the domestic type, Rain." Coulter's voice was low and unbending. "You've got no business here." Hale didn't flinch. His gaze slid past him, landing on Elise. "Ma'am," he said, voice smoother now. "You all right?" She said nothing. "Name's Sheriff Hale. Got folks back east claiming you were taken, saying it wasn't your choice." Elise met his eyes, steady as she could. "I wasn't." "That's so. Then how come no letter, no wire? You up and vanished like smoke." "Because I didn't want to be found." He laughed, sharp and bitter. "That ain't how the law sees it, sweetheart. You belong to someone with pull. Far as they're concerned, you're a missing asset." That's when Coulter stepped in, slow and deliberate, like a storm rolling in. "She doesn't belong to anyone." Hale arched a brow. "You reckon a judge is going to hear it that way?" Coulter didn't blink. He moved square between them. "She's staying." Hale shifted in his saddle, hand brushing the butt of his revolver. And then Elise stepped forward. Her voice was thin, but it carried. "Try to take me, and I'll scream. I'll say you laid hands on me. I'll say whatever it takes." She drew in a breath that tasted like rust and resolve. "I'd rather be buried out here than dragged back." Hale studied her a long moment. "You don't know what you're doing," he muttered. "No," she said, "I didn't. Back when I let others decide for me." There was silence. Then Hale turned his horse, the metal of his stirrups hissing like an accusation. "You'll regret this," he said over his shoulder. Neither of them said a word. They watched him ride off until his figure disappeared into the trees. Only then did Coulter's shoulders drop. Only then did Elise reach out and touch his arm. Just once. He let her. And in the quiet that followed, the threat still hung in the air like wood smoke. But now it was shared. And shared fear, they were learning, was a strange kind of trust. Judson Hale was not the kind of man who accepted silence as an answer. And Coulter Rain had never been the kind who gave one he didn't mean. 2 nights after the sheriff's visit, just as the mountain air dipped into black frost, the sound of hooves shattered the quiet. Elise was setting the kettle on the stove when Coulter moved to the door. He didn't hesitate. He didn't speak. He just reached for his rifle. She followed him without a word. Outside, the dark was full of breath and waiting. 3 men dismounted in the clearing, Judson Hale among them. His coat was open, the sheriff's star catching faint glints of moonlight. In one hand, he held a lantern. In the other, a pistol. "I gave you a chance, Rain," he called out. "This time I'm not asking." Coulter stepped onto the porch like the world wasn't aiming guns at his chest. He said cool and even, "She's not yours." Hale's voice came back like gravel sliding down stone. "You're harboring stolen blood. That woman belongs to someone." "She belongs to no one," Coulter said, his voice low, steady. "Not even me." Behind him, Elise's breath came fast, but her hands were sure. She reached for the shotgun that hung near the hearth. The weight of it settled into her palms like an answer. She had been silent once. She had let someone else decide the course of her life. Not now. The first shot broke the silence, like a bell tolling in war. One of Hale's men screamed and dropped, clutching his thigh. Gunfire cracked the air. Elise ducked, heart pounding. Coulter moved like a shadow, firing, reloading, shifting cover behind the porch beam. He didn't speak. He didn't flinch. Judson Hale shouted orders, dove behind the water trough. The third man tried to flank the cabin, slipping along the side, but he didn't make it past the chimney. Elise caught him in her sights and pulled the trigger. Her arms shook from the recoil, but her aim was true. Then just as suddenly, everything went still. Smoke hung low in the clearing. The porch rail was splintered. The wood beneath Coulter's boots was blackened with powder burns. Somewhere beneath the stairs, the dog whimpered. Coulter stepped forward, rifle lowered but not dropped. His gaze never left Hale. The sheriff's hands rose slowly. "All right," he said, breathless, voice clipped with rage. "All right." Elise stood behind Coulter, still holding the shotgun. Her hands were numb, but her grip hadn't loosened. "Go," Coulter said. Hale didn't move. "This isn't over," he said. "It is for you." The sheriff's face twisted, but he turned, mounted his horse, and vanished into the trees like the threat he always was, a storm that hadn't finished with them yet. Inside, Elise dropped the shotgun onto the table. Her legs nearly gave. Coulter turned to her. "You all right?" She nodded, though the answer was uncertain even to herself. "I'll fix the door," he said. "I'll make tea," she answered. Neither of them smiled. But something shifted. Not joy. Not relief. Something quieter, like a wound that had stopped bleeding. That night, he sat at the table while she stitched the tear in his sleeve. His arm was warm under her fingers, still taut with adrenaline. "You could have let me go," she said softly. "I didn't want to," he replied. She looked up. "I didn't want to either." And then, for the first time, he reached across the distance between them and took her hand, not with possession, not with apology, but with promise. Quiet, earned, unspoken. The days that followed were slow and deliberate, like the thaw that creeps into a frozen field. Coulter rebuilt the porch rail with cedar from the ridge. Each plank he cut by hand, measured twice, nailed once. Elise watched him from the window, his silhouette framed by smoke and wood chips, moving with a kind of reverence for labor. The kind that comes from needing to fix something, anything, when grief offers nothing else. She too began to build. She planted herbs beneath the kitchen window, basil, thyme, a little lavender she had hidden deep in her old bag. Coulter didn't ask why. He just brought her more seeds. Sometimes he spoke, not often. But when he did, each word had the weight of stone, the softness of worn wood. She came to know the meaning of his silences, the one he used when he was thinking, the one that meant he was grieving, the one that meant he was simply listening. He still visited the ridge, always alone. She never followed again. But one afternoon he returned with something wrapped in canvas. He set it down on the table. She opened it carefully. It was a sign carved with blunt instruments and quiet hours. Not Rain Ranch, not Rain's place, not Rain. Just one word. Home. She helped him hang it above the door. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees and turned the hills gold, they sat together at the table, eating stew by lamplight. Neither said much. They rarely needed to. But as she reached across the table, her fingers brushed his. "I want to stay," she said. Coulter didn't flinch, didn't shift his gaze. He simply answered, "You already have." And yet, even with the work and the quiet and the slow rebuilding of trust, something still lingered in Elise's chest. A final weight. One last knot of tethering that hadn't been cut. That night, after he'd gone to his room, Elise sat by the fire alone. The flickering light danced over the walls, casting long shadows. She reached into her bag and pulled out the last thing she hadn't burned. A folded piece of parchment. A birth record. The name printed on it was hers. The name she hadn't spoken in months. The one they'd used to control her. To trap her. She looked at it for a long time, then held it to the flame. Watched the edges curl. The ink darken. The paper vanish. And as the name turned to ash, she sat in the stillness and didn't flinch. By the time spring unfurled across the hills, the snow had melted in slow surrender. Wildflowers began to press up through thawed soil, modest, stubborn things that bloomed without asking for permission. The dog followed Elise everywhere now. His tail wagged with every step she took, like he knew the sound of her breath better than his own name. Coulter built a second chicken coop. She painted the window frame in their room a soft, storm-washed blue. One morning, just as dawn crept through the trees, Elise found a new pair of boots by the door. They were small, broken in, worn just enough. Tucked inside was a slip of paper. For the one who walks beside me. No signature. He never needed one. She slipped them on. They fit perfectly. The creek sang louder as the season turned. The birds returned, filling the space between their silences. The lavender she'd planted pushed its way up through the dirt, delicate but unyielding. She knelt one morning, hands sunk deep in soil, the scent of earth and spring clinging to her sleeves. Behind her, she heard Coulter's boots on the steps. He didn't speak. He simply sat. Watched her work like it mattered. Like watching her plant herbs was a kind of prayer. She looked up. "Do you ever wonder what people say about us down there?" she asked. He shrugged. "They don't know us." She smiled. "No," she agreed. "They don't." That evening, when the hills turned amber and the air tasted like smoke and damp cedar, Elise pulled out a folded sheet of parchment. She wrote. Not a letter, not a confession, but a story. There was a woman with no husband, no name, and no place to go. She was supposed to disappear. She was supposed to stay silent. But then a man who had nothing left gave her a place, not with promises or rescue, but with stillness, with space, with staying. She folded it neatly, placed it on the windowsill beneath a small, flat stone. The next morning it was gone, but in its place was a note, written in Coulter's hand. "You're home, if you want to be."